Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the SA Standstill, SADC Just Transition, and ECOWAS at Work edition of Ubuntunomics podcast. This week, we look at the Mpumalanga MEC arrested for murder, SAA cabin crew protest, PIC financial results, and SA vaccination progress. And in the Africa regional update, we'll be looking at the SADC Energy Subcommittee meeting, the ECOWAS and WAEMU meeting with EU, ECOWAS regional strategy against gender-based violence, and the persecution of migrants in Libya. With me this week is Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this week?
No, I'm well, thank you, Sia. It's been a hectic week, but we survived. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. I can't complain. I've also had a bit of a busy week and I'm joining you from Lusaka this week. Before we get started, I want to start us off with a call to action to all our listeners. On whatever platform you're listening on, please hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all future updates from Ubuntunomics podcast. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like button and feel free to share with family and friends. Let's get started with the SA update this week. Our first story in the SA update is MEC arrested for murder. Mpumalanga member of the Executive Council, MEC for Agriculture, Rural Development, Land and Environmental Affairs, Honorable Mr. Mandla Jeffrey Msibi, was arrested for murder and attempted murder. On Monday, Msibi handed himself over to police in Nelspruit in connection with at least 2 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Msibi is alleged to have been involved in a shooting where 2 people were fatally shot and a 3rd person wounded on the 22nd of August 2021. This brings the total number of people arrested in connection with the case to 3, following the arrests of Joseph Charlingwenya and Tsepo Matsane in September 2021. What are your thoughts on this one, Sbu?
Yeah, I'm still amazed that people still refer to Mr. Msibi as honorable. There's nothing honorable about the man. Anyway, my thoughts are that quality of the cadre would be the first and uppermost consideration when choosing someone to be deployed in government. I think it should not only be based on their qualifications or their popularity, but the content of their character. In this case, it highlights just how low standards of morality and ethics are, and that within our body politics, low standards such as these are acceptable. I mean, murder and violence have become a signature trait of contestation within the once glorious movement. There's too many political killings. President Ramaphosa did, however, immediately call for the application of the step-aside rule when the news broke out. So the PEC, the Provincial Executive Council, acted swiftly and accordingly, and Mr. Msibi was relieved of his duties. But I am, however, left astonished by comments made by the Premier S01E27, who said Mandla Msibi is her comrade and that she has known him over many years. And I quote, "I hold him in very high regard and shall continue to do so until proven otherwise." It makes you wonder how well they know each other, how well she knows him, because the same Mr. Msibi has other 10 pending cases against him. And then there's also the point about factionalism within the ruling party, whether this is some kind of a factional alignment, because soon in the next couple of weeks they'll be going to a provincial conference, and the province is already split into two camps.
Yeah, look, I can't help but wonder what the connection between this shooting and the local government elections is. And I think what we're seeing is a reflection of how dire things have become in terms of our local government elections. We've seen a lot of killings which historically used to be concentrated around the province of KwaZulu-Natal, but also Mpumalanga has been a big feature in terms of political killings, particularly around issues or access to tenders and local government revenues in these municipalities. And I can't help but wonder what we're seeing in terms of the shifting political terrain, in terms of the rising number of independent candidates for the local government elections, being a reflection of the difficult economic environment and the challenges faced by young people as the most unemployed cohort in the country. I mean, if you compare the ages of the other two co-accused, Joseph Chalingwenya and Tsepo Matsane, who are both in their 30s, reflects the fact that the youth are now heavily embroiled and involved in these political killings. And I can't help again to see the link, or at least some level of correlation, between this and the upcoming local government elections and the shifting political terrain. And it's really concerning, particularly given the fact that at local government level, one doesn't need this kind of political fighting and violence, and what we really need are adequate and technocratic bureaucrats who are able to implement a program of local economic development or even spatial development in order to shift the spatial legacy of apartheid and development in the country. And it's just a pity now that things have come up in arms and people are literally fighting in order to access the coffers and public office as a way to earn an income, given the high levels of unemployment we're faced with in the country.
Yeah.
On that note, that brings us to the next story in the SA update, the SAA cabin crew protest. South African Airways SAA is having an open dialogue with the South African Cabin Crew Association, SACA, following a picket at the airline's Kempton Park offices. SACA is picketing against, among other things, alleged unfair working conditions, a 35% wage cut to workers, and the structure of the SAA management. SAA consulted widely with all stakeholders, including staff associations and unions, and is confident that all new agreements reached with parties, either in collective or individual capacity, were negotiated fairly and equitably. However, SAA is not able to revert to prior agreements reached before the business rescue process started. Sbu, you had a point about some of the claims being made by the workers' union.
The workers' union claims, for starters, that they were not even consulted, nor were there any agreements reached with them. They also point to the unfairness of maintaining the same pay scale for management and executives, whereas the workforce have had to take a 35% wage cut. It seems the old strategy of achieving profitability at the expense of workers will apply even in this case, in this reconfigured SAA, whose true corporate structure remains a mystery. It is also clear, as you have said, that agreements reached before the business rescue process will not be upheld by the somehow new entity. but what is this a new entity really, or there's just I mean, we need to know the full legal details about the relaunch of the airline. This is a state-owned enterprise. In any case, we need to know about its shareholding, clarity about the management structure, its registration, whether the company has been re-registered or whatever is applicable. But we just need more light. Everything is just gloomy.
Definitely, definitely. I think you have a point there on the issue of transparency, particularly about the new entity that is SAA and its structures. There needs to be a much greater publicity and transparency with regards to how this information is publicized on the entity. However, I must play a bit of devil's advocate here and ask that perhaps some of the workers pump their brakes a little. Firstly, I think the sector has suffered greatly as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, given the restrictions on people's movement and the movement of goods and services. And this recovery and resumption of business by SAA is under very challenging economic conditions. And so it seems, at least to me, that a wage cut is almost inevitable, especially if workers want to retain their jobs. I think they have a choice between retaining wages and at the same time having to cut jobs in order to make sure that the airline is financially viable, or they have to accept the wage cut in return for retaining their jobs. And I don't think that the cabin crew members can have their cake and eat it in this instance. The other thing which I think you raise is the different approach in terms of the wage cut being applied to cabin crew members and not management. And it seems as though what's good for the goose isn't good for the gander at first sight. But I do want to say that there's a difference in the kinds of skills that management has and their marketability in the labor market compared to the skills of cabin crew members. And I think with all other things equal, it is more likely that management will need to be retained by providing them lucrative or at least market-related salaries so that they're not going to sell their skills in other sectors which may be doing better than the airline industry at the moment. And so there is a bit of more pressure to retain management skills as opposed to cabin crew skills. And given the difficult, challenging economic environment, cabin crew members are more likely to be disposed of in terms of jobs in comparison to management, which is, even though I would say both skills play their selective or different roles and are crucial in the functioning of SAA. But I do want to make a point that there is this inequality between the skills of management and that of cabin crew members. And I think what we're seeing here is a function of that skill dividend and not necessarily hyper exploitation of workers as it's been characterized in the media. I don't know what your thoughts are on that one, Smoo.
I think it's a fair comment. You make a fair comment, but I would say that in this modern era of manager capitalism, what usually happens is that if you have these managers, these as you say, managers who can always they're highly mobile. Now sometimes they'll get something like a 5-year contract or very short term contracts, and they are in most cases renew their salary packages are linked to their performances. So what I would suggest in this case would be to show some empathy, some symbolism could have been shown, creative ways could have been they could have come up with sort of like say we will also take a pay cut, but our pay will be linked to our performance or our share of uh, 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 or a share price sometimes, since this company is being commercialized. So I think if you want to raise morale, you should also be a team player and be creative. You are an executive, and yeah.
I think I'm inclined to agree with your point there that we do expect management to be more creative and find ways to create solidarity with workers rather than implementing very divisive policies such as a 35% wage cut on the lowest wage earners in the sector. And with that said, I think it would have been much more shrewd for managers to take a cut in terms of their guaranteed packages and, bet on the airline actually recovering and then taking a much greater salary at the end of the day through their bonuses once the airline has actually recovered and made its profits in the financial year. Because right now, what the strike actually sets to do is to threaten the whole operation of SAA and thwart the very resumption of operations that management is hoping to successfully implement, and undermines the whole enterprise. And so although I do I do want to play that devil's advocate to say there is this inequality in skills, but I do think that SAA managers could have played a much more creative role in creating solidarity with workers rather than implementing this very divisive policy that they've implemented, which now stands to jeopardize the whole enterprise.
Yeah.
On that note, that brings us to the next story in the SA update. COVID-19 still affecting PIC financials. The impact of COVID-19 pandemic continues to have a prolonged negative impact on the Public Investment Corporation's PIC financial results. According to the Board of Directors, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a significant deterioration of economic conditions, affected financial markets, and increased economic uncertainty. Nonetheless, the PIC has reported operating profits of 551.8 million rand and impairment losses totaling 460,000 rand in the financial year 2020-2021. This compares to 46.3 million rand profits in the financial year 2019-2020 and impairment gains of 110,000 rand. Sbu, what are your thoughts on this one?
See, these results to me simply spell out how poorly the South African government performed on the economic front in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. One can easily deduce that the fiscal response from National Treasury, which was meant to deal directly with the real economy, was inadequate and not properly directed. The over-reliance on private sector initiative and only pinning your hopes on de-risking private debt through government sureties was also ill-advised. I'm referring in this case to the famous 200 billion rand loan, bank loan guarantee scheme, which failed spectacularly. We must remember that the interest rates on loans charged was exactly the same as those of commercial banks. On the other hand, however, even the monetary response was not well timed. It was hesitant. It was conservative. So one would see that in other markets elsewhere, their financial markets recovered much faster and they overshot expectations. And now one sees this when you read about billionaires who have become almost twice as rich even after the pandemic. So they made a lot of money whereas in South Africa we did not. It is no wonder then that the PIC only performed better on its externalized assets, which came to the asset managers' rescue. They grew from 301 billion rand in March last year, 2020, to now 395 billion rand, a 35% jump. And these gains were attributed mostly to the performance of global equities. So the adverse local economic environment is also solidifying the asset managers' diversification strategy into foreign climes. They are now planning to continue to invest more in global equity markets. And now one would remember that the PIC is the country's biggest investor. It invests in South Africa's listed property companies, which have also been negatively affected by these impairments you're talking about, because rentals came under pressure and asset values shrunk as share prices declined. So this is not good for South Africa's fixed asset investment.
Definitely agree with you there. And it's quite interesting, though, that although the financial report seems to blame the poor performance on the COVID-19 pandemic, at least with regards to impairments, the PIC seems to have had a better 2020 in comparison to its 2021. Given that it made impairment losses of 460,000 this passing financial year 2020-21, whilst it made impairment gains of 100,000 the year before. And but nevertheless, I agree wholeheartedly with some of what you're saying, and some have actually referred to the challenges that other asset managers or the asset management enterprise entirely in the country is faced with as a problem of asset allocation and misallocation because of either limited economic opportunities and the amount of uncertainty. But I will always point to one thing as a core problem in the South African economy: the fact that the mass population, the majority black population, has got low and zero incomes, and as a result, this affects aggregate demand across the board. And it's reflected here with the impairments made by the PIC and the fact that even though what we've seen is a gradual easing of restrictions as we come up on 18 months in the pandemic, we've not seen that reflected in terms of economic growth and recovery as what you're referencing in the global economy, given what we've seen in the strong growth in billionaires' wealth as a result of the recovery from the pent-up expenditure that was restricted due to the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 as things started easing in 2021. So apart from the actual issue of misallocation of capital, what we face is low aggregate demand, which does need to be dealt with in order to ensure sustainable development and economic recovery in the country.
Precisely.
On that note, that brings us to the last story in the SA update this week. Quarter of South African adults are vaccinated. Over 10.2 million adult South Africans are now fully vaccinated, which represents 25.7% of the country's adult population. The country has administered a total of 19.5 million doses of vaccines since starting inoculations in March 2021. The leading provinces in terms of number of fully vaccinated persons are Gauteng with approximately 2.5 million, KwaZulu-Natal with 1.7 million, and the Western Cape with 1.5 million. At this rate, South Africa could be on track to meeting the World Health Organization's target of 40% of the population by year end. Sbu, what are your thoughts on this?
South Africa has performed much better than previously envisaged. You might remember how slow off the blocks this country was in the initial stages. From not procuring enough jabs to the embarrassment of getting a shipment from AstraZeneca that was just about to expire. And then there was all that finger pointing between National Treasury and the Department of Health about bungling up the procurement process. So reaching the 40% target will still take a lot of doing. For starters, we have to be honest with ourselves that there is still a lot of hesitancy. I mean, to counter this, the government, in my opinion, should look into focusing more on the rural and peri-urban segment of our population. They should do more there so that we can reach this 40%, because that's where they're getting the best returns in any case, because you will remember that percentage-wise, the province of the Eastern Cape and Limpopo are leading the race. I know you have 2.5 million in numbers. Gauteng is better, but percentage-wise, the more rural settings are more accepting.
True, I agree with you there. It's just a pity, though, that it is also the urban areas that will be the greatest source of spreading the virus, given the high concentration of people. And actually, at these numbers, these are very low levels if you compare them to the total population in these urban centers. For example, with Gauteng, which has a population, I think, between 13 and 14 million South Africans, we only have 2.5 million vaccinations. Similar with KwaZulu-Natal, and I think the population there is around 11 or 12 million. We only have 1.7 million. Similarly with, say, Cape Town. So I do agree with you that we could be making some further progress in rural areas, but it's not until we deal with the urban centers, which have high population concentration and high movement of people, that we'll actually be able to get a hold of or have a hold on this actual COVID-19 pandemic as a country. On that note, on that note, that brings an end to the SA update this week. And again, for all our listeners, on whatever platform you may be listening to us on, whether that be YouTube, Spotify, or any other platform that you're on, please subscribe in order to keep up to date with all future updates from Ubuntunomics podcast. And if you're enjoying this episode, hit the like button and feel free to share amongst yourselves and family and friends. And that brings us to the Africa Regional Update this week. The first story in the Africa Regional Update is SADC meeting of energy subcommittees. The Southern African Development Community SADC convened a 3-day virtual meeting of the energy sector subcommittees, comprising electricity, petroleum, and gas. The meetings aimed to evaluate progress on the implementation of relevant decisions and directives of the SADC heads of state and government, Council of Ministers, and sectoral meetings of ministers responsible for energy and finance and investment. The key issues discussed at the meeting include the draft agreement amending the Protocol on Energy, operationalization of the SADC Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, SACRI, admission of Kafue Gorge Regional Training Center, the KGRTC, as a regional center of excellence, and policy issues related to the electrical energy, renewable energy, petroleum and gas sub-activities, and cross-cutting issues on institutional capacity building. Sbu, what are your thoughts on this one?
We're taking too long getting to finalize decisions. Everyone is already in decisions we all agree on. Yeah. And we're still wasting time in trying to reinvent the wheel. To be fair, though, the global north or the industrialized world is not doing much better either, especially when one considers that We are inching towards COP26, and leaders are not moving at the required speed. We should remember that there was much fanfare and exuberance back in 2011 at COP17 in Durban. That was a decade ago. COP17 was a SADC event in the same way as the Soccer World Cup of 2010 was also called an African event, a SADC event. So firm commitments and mechanisms to drive towards a renewable energy future were made way back then. A policy trajectory was set way back 10 years ago. So Africa, let me say, underdeveloped SADC should act with the necessary urgency to industrialize using green technologies, renewable energy. In this way, we will leapfrog the third industrial revolution. It has not escaped me that they are still talking about extractive industries, like they're talking about petroleum and gas. There are these contradictions the whole world over, and it is understandable. I mean, just now, China made commitments that there will be emissions, optimal emissions will be reached by 2030. And they said we will not be financing any more coal-powered power plants outside of China. But they will be building more power plants, coal-fired power plants right now, because after they had made that commitment, they ran into an energy crisis. So there are those contradictions. These are understandable, but once you have taken a leap, you should go with it. I mean, this also does not excuse the slow pace of regional policy formulation. What will end up happening, like with all production developments, is that individual countries will end up competing against each other, neighbor against neighbor, in trying to attract investment. I mean, the less developed countries now, in that case, will be left behind in an investment world that is increasingly moving away from natural resources, away from extraction, to this new era wherein capital is leading public policy formulation. I mean, capital banks in South Africa have put a stop to financing coal-fired power plants in the same way as international banks are doing. So there is a glut of finance ready to finance renewable energy projects. But we should move on. We should not be bogged down by policy formulation, by things that we are already in agreement. Yeah.
And, for me, this is such a critical issue, mainly because, as you say, there's a glut of money that is available, particularly for the so-called green energy revolution. But we just aren't taking advantage of it on the continent, either due to the lack of prepared projects and even perceptions around risk on the continent, which prohibit the allocation of this capital. Africa still only attracts a measly 2 to 5% of global foreign direct investment, regardless of the sector that is. And if you look at the attraction that we have on green energy, it's even much less. And I would say that, African countries need to leapfrog, as you've put it, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. And for me, it is even much more important for our own industrialization that we take care of our energy needs, particularly taking advantage of the glut of capital that is available in order to invest in renewable energies as the main source and the main base load of energy for African countries in order to enable our industrialization. Without taking care of these energy needs and taking advantage of the glut of capital that is available, we will still be dependent on trying to find ways to export these raw minerals and these extractive minerals, which have far greater environmental impacts than what we actually are aware of at any given time. And again, we shouldn't be wasting time reviewing and analyzing decisions that we already agree on. I think what we need to do is take a few instructive cases or cases which are examples for the rest of the continent and get busy implementing, because otherwise we're going to be left behind in the dark ages.
Yeah.
On that note, that brings us to the next story in the SA update. ECOWAS and WAEMU meet with the EU. Experts from the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the West African Monetary Union, WAEMU, commissions and member states met in Accra, Ghana, as part of the program of the new European Union Cooperation Instrument. The aim of the meeting was to update and harmonize a list of West African regional projects and initiatives, prepare for bankability and financing, responding to emerging needs, and defining the criteria of the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, NDICI, for development and cooperation and EU international cooperation. The new NDICI replaces the previous instruments, including the European Development Fund, EDF, and covers the period 2021 to 2027. West Africa is expected to receive benefit of more than 11.6 billion euros, or 40% of the total envelope allocated to sub-Saharan Africa. Sbu, what are your thoughts on this one?
ECOWAS seems to be steps ahead when it comes to regional economic development. I'm impressed by the cooperation, and this meeting will be about finalizing a list of priority projects. So the concept of a common position for the management of partnerships is a good position to start. To avoid unnecessary competition. That is effective cooperation, because these people, like the story before, these people are in agreement, and I don't know, what do you think gave rise to the revival of this cooperation instrument for development and partnership with the European Development Fund?
Sure. Look, I firstly agree with you that ECOWAS seems to be steps ahead, and they seem to be charting the direction, particularly with regards to deepening of regional integration as well as further development cooperation on the continent. So what seems to be driving this renewed efforts on the relationship between European development partners and the continent is what has been termed the divergent recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. You'll remember that it was firstly the issue of countries' response to the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of monetary and fiscal policy responses that charted a divergent path, with a lot of the northern countries being able to implement anywhere between 10 to 50% of GDP in government spending in order to support their economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Fast forward a couple of months later, when the vaccines became available, we were faced with what is termed the vaccine hoarding, where again northern countries were able to secure sometimes 3 and 4 times their population in terms of number of doses of the vaccines that were available. And we're still faced with some African countries with less than 10% of their populations inoculated at this point. So really the concern is that moving forward, there is this huge divergence between those who have and have not, with some of the poorer countries not able to access and even distribute vaccines equitably across their jurisdictions, but also in terms of the economic recovery and the economic resumption of activity that is needed. governments are unable to spur and support economic growth and economic recovery in their economies. Hence, the closer role that development partners want to play. Obviously, the West African region representing a huge swath of the Sahel, which has been challenged by continuing perennial violence and other development challenges, there is a concern that this divergence is going to result in a complete loss of the region and uncontrollable levels of violence that is akin perhaps to parts of eastern DRC, which have been in conflict for now close to 3 decades. So the development partners are heavily concerned with this divergence and are trying by all means to provide mechanisms to ensure that there's some level of convergence in terms of what countries can do in their economic recovery, but also their public health response to this COVID-19 pandemic. And whilst African countries are still facing the challenge of the current pandemic, most northern countries are actually at the phase where they're planning their preparedness for the coming pandemic. And so I think this is what's really driving the interest in order to cooperate and help or work more closely with southern countries in order to ensure a convergence in terms of development and economic recovery from the pandemic. On that note, that brings us to the next story in the SA update. ECOWAS fights gender-based violence. Gender experts from ECOWAS member states met in Dakar, Senegal to draft a regional strategy for combating gender-based violence, GBV, and sexual harassment. Adoption of the regional strategy is a response to the need to consolidate member states' efforts to end violations of the rights of women and girl child in ECOWAS. The strategy would be submitted to the ECOWAS ministers in charge of women affairs and gender for adoption, ratification, and implementation. Sbu, you had a point to make with regards to how these regional cultures and the histories are sort of a precondition and factors that influence how countries and the region deals with some of these development challenges.
Yes, regional cultures, the histories and socio-economic conditions are factors that influence the form of societal ills prevalent in the different parts of the continent. I say this because I noticed that the regional strategies mentioned in this communication is about sexual harassment in the workplace and educational institutions in West Africa. The home is not mentioned. We saw in South Africa that even during the hard lockdowns of the COVID-19 pandemic, gender-based violence cases remained high. In fact, they increased. The home, I'm talking about among relatives and loved ones, was not a safe place. This shows how badly we in Southern Africa have been affected by the migrant, mine laborer, and Bantustan homeland systems. These destroyed the fabric of our societies, not only in South Africa, I should mention, even as far as places like Malawi, Mozambique, even in places like Namibia and up as far as Zambia, because we had a similar system. So, and I've read how in West Africa the patriarchal system pertaining in that part of the world preys on young women who are in tertiary institutions. There's that whole sexual abuse for a university pass. So all in all, a strategy must take into consideration prevailing social and cultural conditions and talk to those. So yeah, because even in Kenya, I read about this lady, this 10,000 meter world record holder or something like that. She was murdered by her husband just yesterday. Yeah. So yeah. I think in West Africa they don't have it as gender-based violence as bad as we have it in Southern Africa because of these historical factors.
On that note, that brings us to the last story in the Africa Regional Update: migrant persecution in Libya. Migrants and asylum seekers in Libya have been facing increasingly heavy-handed treatment from targeted security operations, which have resulted in fatalities and a steep increase in detentions. Migrants and asylum seekers face a myriad of daily violations and abuses at the hands of both state and non-state actors in Libya. The safety and well-being of at least 1,000 women and children, including 5 unaccompanied children and at least 30 infants held in detention centers in Tripoli, is under threat. Detention centers across Libya are way over capacity, and the largest detention center, Al Mabani, is currently holding more than 5,000 people, which is 4 times its official capacity. Smoo, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, Libyan conditions of incarceration have always been very tough, especially during the years of Muammar Gaddafi's regime. I think their conditions are similar to those of Turkey, another place where you don't want to be incarcerated. Similar to those of Egypt, similar to those of Sudan. I don't know whether the Islamic culture has something to do with it or not, but it's just those places you just don't want to be jailed in.
On that note, that brings an end to the Africa Regional Update this week, and that brings us to the numbers game. The number for this week is 1.8%. So I'll give you one guess. What do you think this number is related to?
I think that's the drop in manufacturing. I think I heard something about manufacturing this week.
I think congratulations. Well, it's not a drop, it's actually an increase, but I think it's the first time you've been spot on in terms of what the number is related to. So it's actually manufacturing production is up 1.8% year on year in August 2021. So in August 2021, manufacturing production increased by 1.8% year on year, and seasonally adjusted manufacturing production increased by 7.6% month on month. This compares to a contraction of 4.1% year on year in July and an 8% increase month on month. The largest positive contributions were made by the food and beverages subsector, which increased by 9.7%, contributing 2.3%, motor vehicles, parts, and other transport equipment, which increased by 17.7%, contributing 1.4 percentage points, and basic iron, steel, and non-ferrous metal products, which increased by 7.6%, contributing 1.4 percentage points. The largest contraction was made by petrochemicals, which contracted by 21.8%, subtracting 5.6 percentage points from manufacturing production. So there you have it, manufacturing production up almost 2% in August 2021. On that note, that brings an end to our episode this week.